So today has been rather exhilarating by my standards, which doesn't mean a hell of a lot. But we're going to talk about Sapiens, which I've done something I haven't done with any other book before, which is little dives as I'm reading it into aspects that I really wanted to hit on. And the reason is because it has such a broad scope, so many different aspects to it. I could have done this with the History of Debt book as well, perhaps. But in particular, this has so many different areas of philosophical, sociological, anthropological interest to me that I felt particularly engaged with it and wanted to go into it. I'm not going to go too much into details, especially about the things that I've already touched on. I've noted them all as Sapiens sub-book discussion, if that's something you want to discuss. But this is sort of an overall review of the book. Now, on the most part, he paints in very, very broad strokes throughout it. By the way, he's got, incredible, you see Bill Gates on here. He's got incredible people listed here. Normally you're looking at things and you have, you got New York Times, Wall Street Journal, great. But not only does he have a Bill Gates recommendation on it, he has a Barack Obama one on it. He's currently doing the talk show circuits right now, which is just a matter of serendipity as far as I'm concerned, for whatever his new book is, which also sounds interesting. He paints in incredibly broad strokes, but brings a viewpoint that in many ways is similar to my own, which is sort of this modern skeptic with this broad interest in, at least in this book, in the overall history of humanity. Not really, he calls it the history of humankind, but I would say it goes well into prehistory and brings together a number of disciplines in a way that I find incredibly compelling, right? Again, it's in broad strokes, it's very much a popularization. It's not going into absolute details on everything. And in some cases, I found myself saying, yes, but, and then sometimes he answers the yes, but. In a couple of cases, from my own plateau or ivory tower, I have, this kind of, you're missing part of the story and it's a really important part, or you're being blinded by your own preconceptions. Obviously, we all are. That's just the nature of things. But for the most part, I do find that his align nicely with mine, although I do run into some cases where they don't. And then a whole bunch. I don't think I've ever seen this many, plaudits or whatever within one, and for whatever reason. But I found it incredibly enjoyable, regardless of that. So now he spans running from basically, Paleolithic era and working through the cognitive revolution. That's the first chapter that he deals with, which is really that point at which we start telling stories to one another, is how he views it. Now this is taking one particular view in the anthropological sector as his credo or whatever for how he's going to deal with that whole section. And he really takes that on, you know, and it's kind of related to the viewpoint that I don't think it's as far fringe, but the viewpoint that Phil Eklund ascribes to in what the hell was it? Origins of Humanity or whatever. It might have helped me to have more knowledge, not what I have here, but more knowledge in general when I played that game about what the viewpoint that he's looking at is, because there were some aspects that were just very, very weird in that game and did not seem intuitive at all. But anyway, in terms of the book, he presents a high-level overview of this theory and how it links to what kind of anthropological evidence we have, as well as then some of the myths that made it down to us. And a couple of them there, a day in the life. Well, he actually works on the biblical there. First is Animal of No Significance, which is just showing the early hominid experience and the early Homo sapien experience before this revolution happens. But then he looks into things with more biblical terminology to the chapter titles. But the reality is he's linking them to the things which we do actually know from the anthropology. Then he goes into the agricultural revolution, which, for a long time now, we've kind of known that agriculture really significantly decreased the standard of living, the lifespan of the average human who was under it. But it did allow for a rapid expansion of population as it happens. And, he goes into a number of again, the more prevalent theories here. He doesn't, cover the whole span of the theories. Basically, any one of these subject matters, if you wanted to look at, even as a broad popularization overview, you would from a particular, across various different. As I stumble over my thoughts, across various different sort of theories that go for them, it would take a book this size at least to give that popular overview of any one of these. So you can see how lightly his treatment has to be across the world, across the whole of it. But one of the key things is that the cognitive revolution led to the ability, those myths, those stories that we tell and share, and this becomes kind of a theme throughout, became almost a necessity for the agricultural revolution, for bands to grow to the kind of size that you could start seeing little city-states and such not growing. Because his argument is that basically any given human can have like social connections with about 150 other people max. And that in order to have a relationship that makes sense with more than that, i.e. to form, a city, because 150 people is not a city, right? That we kind of needed these myths to link us together and to create a sort of a shared experience. And this is what I consider tribalism, right? Where, hey, I'm a New York Mets fan, and you just sort of identify as that, just like you do with political party, with nationality, with ethnic background, with religion. All these things are really kind of what he's going to describe as myths or stories, and foundational aspect of that is the cognitive revolution. But taking it later and heavier, he goes to the unification of humankind, where he discusses this sort of arc through history where we've become more and more consolidated one way or another, right? Our empires may not be as big as the British Empire or, the Habsburg Empire was at their height. But culturally, there's something kind of like a monoculture beginning to form in a way that never had before. And, it's got its ups and downs. There's no question about that. And the reactionary forces that we see are kind of against that right now. Well, as they have always been. But he takes us through several different aspects of where we've kind of converged and accepted a singular sort of concept and a singular story, a singular myth, and kind of accepted it across the board. And some of those are, and I'm not going over every chapter, but I'm mentioning things. Money, the ideas of kind of a unified monetary system and the economics there is one of the big ones. The empires, the growth of empires, etc. This is something that required a myth, a story to make it work. Religion is clearly a major one. You had these minor religions early on, these local religions, right? But now we have sort of globe-spanning religions. And that, really the monotheistic religions, well, and Buddhism as well, sort of expanded rapidly to become an idea that a lot of people ascribe to. And all of these, came into conflict with other mechanisms, whatever, that were in place, but won out. And in winning out, they managed to become larger and larger throughout. Then he hits the scientific revolution, which is really the longest of these sections, 4 major areas. And how much, what I would say is that myth structure, and I think you'd agree there, or story structure, or whatever, but I'd also say it fit under the ideologies that, he talks about when we're looking at the religions and whatnot, and the other kind of stories that we have. It is a very similar type of thing, but it's a type of thing that triggered a different kind of expansion, growth, whatever, because it was based on this certain concepts of good, right? Like that knowledge of the universe is good. Now, this isn't something that he really hits on in terms of knowledge being a good. In fact, this is where I see one of his blindnesses, is that instead of like looking at, if you just looked at the 10 Commandments, you would be a good person. Or if you, followed a life based on the life of Jesus, or followed a philosophy similar to the Buddhist one, you would come to the good, and that it develops from that. Instead, for the scientific revolution to work, really what had to happen was the decision had to be that exploration of the observable surroundings, and the application of rational thought to that, rather than necessarily to the Bible or whatever, is what would give us a greater understanding, and that understanding is a good thing. I don't think there are many people who, let's say you're a religious person of the book, you're Christian, Islamic, Jewish. I don't think anybody there would say, I think in general there they would say the study of the Bible would give you a greater understanding, and the study of the great writers who have come afterwards and have refined or untangled aspects of the books that, well, the Bible, I shouldn't use the Bible, the study of whichever book or books would give you a greater understanding, and that would be a good. So it's not like knowledge itself is a new idea here. It's that the kind where the knowledge is applied. Now, certain ancients seem to have latched on to the same kind of thing that triggered the scientific revolution. So it's kind of weird, and he doesn't go into this, sort of why was there a failure of those to catch on and to snowball in the same way that, you have to look at when the scientific revolution kind of started, and you start seeing that, it wasn't like everybody just started accepting that, their observations and concepts of experimentation and whatnot were the right things. It was a very, very small minority, just like it was a small minority back in the ancient times. And now there's sort of a very widespread acceptance of these thoughts in a way that didn't grow out of the ancient times. And he didn't go into why we didn't hit that, which is one of the things that I think is a very interesting question. And, why did it succeed in, the 17th century, or starting in the 17th century more or less? And honestly, you can go way back, because, like I pointed out, the scholastics, he takes it from sort of the more dogmatic view that, 17th century everything changed. But the truth of the matter is, outside of, the Dark Ages, you've got this constant bubbling minority. And maybe you did then too, but outside of the Dark Ages, you have this constant bubbling minority, going back to maybe the 11th century or so after the Dark Ages, and then before it with the ancients, that was engaged in this kind of information and gathering this up. So it was really kind of this Dark Ages collapse, just like the old Bronze Age collapse, which seems to have disrupted life enough that there just wasn't room for that anymore. But none of that explains really why we had this snowballing effect and why the modern era has become so enamored with and willing to embrace, etc., the change and everything. Now, what he says, what he argues is that admitting ignorance was kind of the key point. But again, the elites in ancient times were willing to admit a great deal of ignorance. It's not like, Aristotle was looking and saying, yes, but the gods did this. They would pay lip service the same way as you would see, again, you would certainly see a lot of Christianity working its way into the scholastics, and you would see a lot of Islam working its way into an earlier period. And actually, if you look at the Islamic golden era, you're looking at one that's kind of growing with the religion, essentially, and then becomes cut off sometime after Christianity kind of picks it up and runs with it. But there's just this incredible blooming that happens, and he does not go into an effective argument as to why that's different from earlier eras. His argument that we're willing to admit ignorance, I think, is a little naive, like many things in this. But then he goes into things that came forward in that same period. Just checking my camera because I can't see. I should really turn the little screen to myself. But there, where science and the empires sort of facilitate one another, right? So scientific discoveries that were happening in the, Christian European West were just like coming at the same time and aiding a desire for expansionism, and the need for gold and whatnot. And then he starts hitting into the growth of capitalism, which kind of grew out of the mercantilist era, and then you start seeing the joint stock companies and this, that, and the other. And again, it's a clever play, a clever invention, essentially, that you see coming out of Renaissance Italy, essentially, in the banking families and whatnot, that allows for, and this may be the most important step, honestly, that allows for this sort of the semi-person of a corporation that's able to protect individual owners. They're just in for the shares that they've given, essentially. Now, you had other things that would work this way. You would have, loans, which are similar to bonds and whatnot. But here you had something where somebody else was actually, where other people were actually allowed to have a stake. And I think you had only very limited examples of this kind of thing, where maybe a couple of people or a small group would go into a partnership when you go back to ancient era. But here you have that expanded to something much larger, where the laws begin to support that very nicely and everything. So that's an important invention. And the thing is that the capitalism fuels more research, etc., in its own way. And certainly nowadays, real research very seldomly is being done by the individual clever person. It's being done within the auspices of either a corporate environment or a research institution, either governmental or educational. And how the capitalism and the technological advances just sort of whir together and build up this higher speed. And maybe to some extent that is his argument as to why you have the scientific explosion happening, where everyone now, or at least the vast majority of us, kind of accepts what I call an ideology of scientism when it comes down to it. I don't remember what a permanent revolution was about. Yeah, that's the expansion of changes and whatnot, and how they kind of started, heavily impacting the social structures as well. The same way people were investigating different ideas in terms of how the physical world was interacting. We're also looking at different ways of organization, and in a way, again, you could kind of argue that that's intrinsically linked to that hey, there's this different way of organizing how we assume risk, and joint ownership. And then he goes into basically a discussion of societal happiness, which I found particularly interesting and did there. And then one interesting thing, one of the follow-ups that I had, which was that, look, I think before I got to that last chapter, I think where we're going is really kind of like, we have to look at an AI as our future, right? As our progeny. What we could send out, something mechanical that's intelligent, as to what we can really send out into the universe, because we're not, as biological creatures, really all that resilient and capable of lasting forever, right? Well, he actually goes further than that and proposes 3 different possibilities there as to branch outs. One is indeed the AI. That's actually the last of his options. One is that, look, we're developing medical advances that are blurring that line more and more as to what is sort of ethical, and that things like, gene splicing and stuff like that, if it's going to improve our health, we're almost assured to take that route rather than, shy away from it because, there are some scary things about the idea of trying to create a superhuman race or whatever. So that's a second way, actually, his first. And then the middle choice was kind of a cyborg type modification where, we would be combining the biological that we have with, mechanical aspects that would allow us to increase and improve our abilities in some way or another. In a way, he argues that these are, one aspect of that. Yes, they're not intrinsic to my body, but you start putting pacemakers in, and, we start to correct defects in our bodies. We've got people who, have mechanical limbs, whatnot. There's possibility of putting chips into the brain to help regulate certain aspects that, are seen as a flaw, maybe to help the biology along with, maintaining happiness or whatever. The same way we'd use chemicals, we might also use mechanical aspects to help trigger those chemicals in flowing and whatever. And that each of these 3 is a possibility, and, we don't know which way or ways we're going to take. It seems almost inevitable that anything that will help us medically, though, is just a little foot in the door that makes it much, much harder to argue against the broader and more frightening aspects of it. I found the entire book, almost all of it, very, very thought-provoking, very interesting, so much in alignment with the kind of crap that I think about. And yes, he does a much, much better job of creating a cohesive story here. But the problem with big cohesive stories is that they miss parts of it. All those yes buts and whatnot. And I feel that, in trying to nail down something that was an interesting and cohesive story, he left, as well as, at this level of abstraction that it fits in a book and that, a lay reader like me can enjoy and understand. Well, he ends up leaving out lots of bits, and that's fine. Overall, I think it's a really, really interesting read. I'm actually probably going to give this one back. Because I don't think that it's the kind of thing that I want to use as a regular reference or anything. And if I just put it in behind with all, the mostly fiction stuff that I keep, that I want to reread, I think it just, ends up being forgotten then. And I think it's a good idea to pass something like this along and let someone else enjoy it. So I think this is going to go to one of the little libraries, just like I found it. But yeah, I was really, really impressed with just the amount of stuff that he covers in it and the level at which he covers it. Even if that level causes me to have my little arguments with the things that I've thought relatively deeply on. And I think the most impressive thing to me is how much it feels like it aligns with my own viewpoint as to how to explore things and, how to put pieces together and connect everything together into one sort of flow. And I'm assuming it's kind of cool in that. One thing that I find kind of cool about that is when I look at the number of people, how popular it is, whatever, the only thing I can assume is, I'm not that different from everybody else. Not just, people who've done really successfully, but also I'm guessing, a lot of people have found at least parts of it to be very, very engaging, and I would assume a large part of it. I don't know how much they sit back and say, yes, but I suspect a lot of people do, one way or another, just because we all come, there's this shared culture and society that I feel like, a connection with. But then there are things where there's significant differences in terms of how we view things. And I don't know. I just found it a very good read. Now, I want to talk a little bit, if I got a little bit of time, about something else, and I don't. Okay. Briefly, I said it was an exhilarating day. It's because I did a little bit of work, started cleaning my roof. Not much. I got tired, but I actually started. But also, I've read in the last 24 hours or less, more like 18 hours. I've read the rules to 2 games, and haven't been able, and was about to start the one that I thought would be the easier to do, and then I realized, wait, I actually read the wrong rule book. I have the advanced version of the game as well. They came together. And that's the rule book I should be reading. And then I'm like, well, do I want to do the more complicated thing that I'm going to be doing for probably longer? Or do I want to just do the light one first and then dive into the more complicated thing so that I have time to read more rule books and avoid doing anything terrible like Empires and Arms? Okay, anyway, up it goes.